Mr. Hook, thank you for being with us.
Thanks. Good morning.
Good morning. Critics of President Trump's maximum pressure strategy argue that the campaign is not delivering the desired results, and they point to Iranian belligerence in the region. Iran is suspected of being behind, highly suspected of being behind the attacks on tankers in Fujairah, attacks on tankers in the Gulf of Oman, attacking pipelines in Saudi Arabia, sending drones from Yemen into Saudi Arabia. They argue that this is a result of a strategy by the administration that is delivering the opposite of results. Not a peaceful Iran, but a more belligerent one. What would you respond to that?
I would say that what we're seeing in the recent weeks is essentially Iran's foreign policy for the last 40 years. This is a regime that from its beginnings has been trying to export revolution and violence around the Middle East to create a Shia corridor of control that stretches from Lebanon all the way to Yemen. And so we have put in place the strongest sanctions in history against the Iranian regime. They don't like it. But the fact that they're responding the way that they are should tell you something about how effective these sanctions are. We are denying the regime up to $50 billion in oil revenue exports. At the same time, their proxies around the region are experiencing a financial strain that they've never experienced before. Hezbollah and Hamas and their proxies in Iraq and Syria. And so we have put in place the right foreign policy at the right time. It's long overdue. And everything that we're dealing with now is in many ways inevitable, because this Iran deal, the nuclear restrictions are going to lift eventually. And Iran would probably be doing exactly what they're doing today down the road, but they'd be stronger. So we decided to get out of the deal now so that we can confront them now.
U.S. officials have made it clear time and again that regime change in Iran is not the goal of the maximum pressure strategy and is not central to U.S. policy. I know you can't comment on intelligence assessments in the United States, but based on your experience in dealing with Iran and studying Iran, what do you think will happen in an Iran after the supreme leader? Should he pass away or should he be removed from power? What does that look like? What should we be looking for?
I don't think anybody has a crystal ball when it comes to leader succession. It's very hard to predict these things. What we've said is that the future of Iran is up to the Iranian people. They're going to decide that. It's not going to be the United States. But what we do know is that the Iranian people want a more representative government. This is a corrupt religious mafia that robs its own people blind in order to fund a violent ideology. They suppress the people at home and they export revolution abroad. And so I think the Iranian people are tired of the regime's foreign policy, which drains so much money from the treasury in Iran. And when we look at what the Iranian people say when they protest, they want them out of Syria. They want them to stop spending money in Lebanon. I'll give you one interesting statistic. Your average Lebanese Hezbollah fighter makes more than your average Iranian firefighter. And this is because Iran provides 70% of Hezbollah's budget every year. That's $700 million. We've been able to dramatically reduce the amount of money that Iran has available to give to Hezbollah. And as a consequence, Hezbollah has to do fundraising campaigns now. Another example of how our sanctions are working.
Secretary Mnuchin recently announced that the president had instructed him to sanction Jawad Zarif sometime this week. What do you think is the aim of sanctioning Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif? What will that achieve?
On Monday, the president authorized sanctions on the Supreme Leader and on the officers and assets in the Supreme Leader's front office. He also imposed sanctions on 7 or 8 IRGC officials who are responsible for the attacks on tankers. And he also directed the Secretary of the Treasury to impose sanctions on Foreign Minister Zarif. But what we're able to announce so far is what happened on the Supreme Leader's accounts. And what I would say there is that the Supreme Leader has been able to enrich himself at the expense of the Iranian people. He has many billions of dollars through his Sita. It's a slush fund, it's a hedge fund. And this is something which Secretary Pompeo talked about in June of last year. that this is a religious leader who has his own hedge fund. And that should tell you something about the corruption of this regime, its hypocrisy, that while his own people are struggling, he's running a hedge fund. We have now put sanctions on that. And within that hedge fund, you have thousands of board members and officers and corporate leaders who are all going to be affected by this. And it's the right thing to do.
Does this include financial institutions that are dealing directly or indirectly with this fund abroad, whether they be in Turkey or other regions around Iran?
I think the Department of the Treasury will have specific guidance on that. And so on the OFAC website, which anyone can visit, there'll be specific guidance on that in terms of the risk that you have to avoid. But I would say, since the Iranian regime, since 1979, has had a financial system that is deliberately dark. They don't want you to follow the money. And if you are a businessman and you are doing business in Iran, you never know for sure whether you're facilitating terrorism or commerce. And so much of the money that ends up in Iran through these banks, they do money laundering, they do terror finance. They have spent billions of dollars supporting Assad's war machine. And so if you're an investor, it's very possible that the money that you are transacting in Iran is going to find its way into Assad's chemical weapons program or into a missile that is fired by the Houthis that goes into Saudi Arabia and kills innocent people.
Secretary Pompeo mentioned that the United States wouldn't tolerate Iranian attacks on the US or its allies directly by the regime or by its proxies. We've been seeing that as part of Iran's reaction to the maximum pressure campaign. Attacks from Yemen have been ramped up. We've seen attacks on oil pipelines originating from Yemen. We've seen Houthi drones that are suspected to be Iranian-made flying into Saudi Arabia and conducting attacks. And we've seen missiles falling on civilian infrastructure such as airports. Is there a change to the US policy vis-a-vis the Yemen war as a result of what we've been seeing in terms of heightened tensions after the maximum pressure campaign?
It's a very good question. My first stop on this trip to the Gulf was to Saudi Arabia. And I met in Jeddah with the Deputy Defense Minister, Prince Khalid bin Salman, and with Dr. Mossad Al-Eban, the National Security Advisor. We discussed Yemen at length. And we have been, as part of the coalition, trying to degrade Houthi capabilities and to interdict arms shipments and to improve targeting. Iran has been launching attacks through their Houthis into Saudi Arabia for years now. We know that Iran aspires to do with the Houthis what they did with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And we have to deny Iran the ability to gain a foothold on Saudi's southern border. The United States has for many years made peace and security and stability a hallmark of our foreign policy in the Gulf. And so we cannot allow Iran to lay deep roots in Yemen. They have been the biggest impediment to implementing the UN-led political process to bring an end to the fighting. It's Iran with their Houthi partners that have been the biggest obstacle to the cause of peace in Yemen. And so we are doing what we can to accelerate the political process, to end the fighting and to end the humanitarian catastrophe. But the Iranians don't want this war to end. They have been able to lay some roots, shallow roots, in Yemen. Iran threatens to close the Strait of Hormuz. Imagine if they're able to become a power broker in Yemen. They will then threaten to close the Bab el-Mandeb and be a threat to freedom of navigation in the Bab el-Mandeb and in the Strait of Hormuz. We have to deny them this capability. And so that's why we're working very closely with coalition partners to do what we can. Saudi Arabia has a right to defend itself against Iranian surrogates attacking them. And so I had a very good visit in Saudi Arabia to discuss these issues.